thank you very much. And it's for the invitation to come here and participate and share some ideas. It's been a wonderful experience, and to hear people about what they're doing, and to see a number of my colleagues from past experiences in working in the Crown. So that's been really nice. And I was tasked with the idea of talking about lessons learned in managing recreation. And I will specifically talk about lessons about public lands and what we see kind of out in the field. So, and finally, I would like to say that working in the Crown has been a really important experience for me. And I would like to acknowledge that if it wasn't for the American Indian tribes and First Nations, we wouldn't have the outstanding scenery and outstanding biodiversity and stunning scenery that we have now. That is the basis for our tourism industry that attracts millions of people today. And that's very important part, I think, of managing recreation. So you can go to slide 2, please. Next slide. What I'm going to talk about is these lessons learned, and a bit of this is how we think. Okay, I've done a lot in recreation management, but as I get older, and I'm getting pretty old now, I think about how we think. Okay, and that's what I do now primarily, is think about how we think about managing recreation. So I'm going to briefly review these lessons, briefly review just a few of these lessons, because there are dozens, if not hundreds, of these lessons. And at the end of the presentation, there's several slides that are an appendix, and I'm not going to show those because we don't have time to do that. And so you can get them. Sorry, Natalie. You can get the presentation from Natalie or from me, and you can see what a few dozen of these lessons learned deal with. So now, next slide. Yeah, okay. Lessons learned, just to briefly review, are the basis for managing adaptively and for building resilience in our social ecological systems. That's how we manage adaptively. We learn. And we learn when we make mistakes. That's the principal way in which we learn. But we also learn when we think critically about what we are doing, which is kind of the physical thing, what we're doing. We learn also when we think critically about how we do that. And then most important, we learn why, when we think about why we do it. Okay, and often the why is missing from our conversation. So next slide. So lessons learned, and there are many definitions of this, but this is my definition. It involves basically two components, a specific, explicit evaluation of what factors or processes or thinking that lead to a success or a failure of a policy or action. And then second part of this is how to apply that evaluation to specific policies or actions that will, in the future, increase the probability of success of that action or policy. Now, I want to say that our experience we have, and I hear it a lot in these presentations, because I analyze these presentations at a deeper level. We have a lot of failures. That's not to be ashamed about. We've tried a lot of different things. So lessons learned is very important when it comes to managing recreation. Now, there are dozens of these and hundreds of these. So I'm going to just show you a few of these and how they relate to each other through a framework that I have established based on some other reading outside the field of recreation management. So next slide. Okay, so we have a lot of lessons, and they occur, you might call these different categories or different levels. At the first level, the most I don't want to say superficial, but the most visible level is we learn by reacting to what we see. We see something such as we drive up to, say, an access like Benchmark in the Bob Marshall, or we drive up to the Avalanche Lake trailhead in Glacier, and we see lots of cars, and we react to that and think about, oh, wow, there must be lots of people that are there. The second level, and which occurs below that, is we look at trends and patterns of use, and we've been doing a lot of that in this meeting. And Professor Freiman specifically talked about some of these trends, but more important, he talked about a way to think about these trends by using the adaptive cycle. And in that way, we anticipate what might happen, because we're thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And below that level, we have to design and plan what will happen. That's because we're managers and we're custodians and we practice stewardship. So we have to think about what's going to happen in the future, what we want to happen that's consistent with the mandates that we have. And below that level is that we examine the fundamental assumptions and mental models that we have that we're operating from. And so we have these 4 different levels that are all linked. So I'm going to give you an example, and these are lessons learned that I think we can all relate to. So next slide. So we drive up to those trailheads I mentioned below, and we think, oh, look at all those vehicles, look at all those people. This place must be devastated. The trail into the Bob may be devastated. Indeed, there are lots of muddy spots on that trail. I've been up it many times. and we say, gee, use level leads to a lot of impacts. But what we've learned through a variety of research and experiences is that many of our visitor impacts are a function of behavior more than the level of use. So what type of conveyance do we use? Do we hike in? Do we go by horse? Do we go by bicycle? And we had someone talk about that yesterday, that specifically with respect to user fees. So we learn when we react that it's not just use level, it's something else. So next slide. Okay. And when we look at the trends and patterns that are underlie that, we've learned that trends and patterns of use are always changing. That what happened in the past is not necessarily very predictive of what's going to happen in the future. And so we see trends of use. We have a graphic and we say, wow, that use is going up. Well, that doesn't always work. And we just have the last 2 years to look at that. Our experience there went down a lot in most places in April of 2020. And then it shot up again, and it shot up much higher. So our trends and patterns of visitor use are always changing. The next thing we have to do, the next thing we've learned is designing and planning what will happen. So the next slide. Is that we've learned that when we design and planning what will happen It's these desired experiences drive demand. Okay, so underlying these trends and patterns is people's desired experiences. So that means we have to understand what these experiences are. And then we have to understand how they are linked to these trends and patterns. And for example, pardon me, and it's been noted in this meeting that there is some difference now between what used to be the recreationists and what is now the recreationists. For example, just one major difference, particularly the Park Service is experiencing, is there are very little foreign visitors, okay, because foreign travel wasn't allowed for a long time. But more importantly, I sense anyhow, that a number of visitors are interested in health and wellness, more so than we've had in the past. And obviously we have more visitors that are inexperienced and know very little about being in the outdoors and so on, and leave impacts. But more visitors seem to have an interest in using the out of doors as a place to get away from, say, sickness, or to be active and get some fresh air, whatever. And as another example, I was just yesterday, I don't live very far from the Blue Mountain Recreation Area in Missoula, which is, I know it's just outside the Crown. But I went over to the trailhead, their main trailhead, and it was full. Okay, and as you know, being in the Crown today, it is cold out there. So all these people were out, and it was cold. So there's something happening there. So desired experiences drive the demand. That's one thing we've learned. And then next slide, we've learned that when we plan, those are based on a set of fundamental assumptions that we have, how we see the world. And most of us, when we plan, we use a model of planning called rational comprehensive planning. And I don't have time to go into all this, but it's a reductionistic way of thinking about the world. And we also, when we drive up to that trailhead, we tend to have a very negative view of recreation use there. It's going to be crowded, it's going to be congested, there's going to be lots of impacts and so on. And I'm not going to argue with that. But if we take new assumptions, we might look at that recreational use in a new way. So I will ask Natalie to go to the next slide, which is almost my last one. And so we can look at recreation use growth as negatively, okay? Or we can look at it as, wow, it's an increase in well-being, that people are using these resources that we all manage, that actually they're using it for not necessarily to get away from other people, but they're using it to keep healthy. And so you look at all those people that are using those places. Look at the people that are using the trailhead, the trails in the Blue Mountain Recreation Area. You know, think of all for example, the cardiovascular fitness that's occurring when these visitors start walking around. So we change our assumptions. We've learned that if we change our assumptions about our planning and about how we think conventionally, we might change how we perceive a particular change in recreational use. So next slide. So when we'll look at this, we've learned another lesson, kind of what you might say a meta lesson. And that is, when we dive deeper, we begin to learn and see that we're dealing with a system. And we've spent a lot of time in our management and our research, looking at parts. But when we dive deeper, we see that excuse me, we dive deeper then, and we see this is a system, and it's composed of many different parts, and those parts have to work together in order for the system to work. And by diving deeper, we begin to think differently. We go from synthesis to analysis in our thought process. We go from developing knowledge about specific parts to thinking. We go from knowledge to understanding about how these parts work together to produce something, whatever that is. It could be health, it could be solitude, it could be something other. And then by thinking differently about this, we are able to act holistically. And there's been a little bit of discussion about this, but if we act holistically, we can do more in the way of integration. We see the process of producing recreation as something more, and Mary Riddle talked about this, and she said, had a beautiful statement, that managing recreation involves more than one division in the Park Service. It involves more than visitor management or interpretation. It involves law enforcement. It involves maintenance. It involves vegetation management, wildlife management, and so on. And so by acting holistically, I define that as people sitting around a table, regardless of their background, all with different expertise. And going back to the discussion a little bit earlier, they're green people, they're purple people, they're yellow, white, green, and so on. They're acting holistically and lending their expertise to solve a particular problem. So within my short period of time, that's all I have right now. And again, I want to thank for being invited here. It's been a wonderful experience for me. See what ideas that people have. Thank you.